Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Herger. I'm the Mapping and Regulations Coordinator with the Critical Area Commission for the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays. Thank you for joining us tonight on our live stream event. I'm going to go over a couple of ground rules before we get started so you all know how to communicate with us. This event is a one-way live stream, so if you have a question for either myself, who will be presenting to you shortly, or to my colleague Ryan Mello, who will also be presenting shortly, there is a public chat box and you can find it on your screen along the bar near the bottom, and it will have a Q&A button there for question and answers. It's the second to last button on the right. When you click on that button, a chat box should pop up on the right hand side of your screen where you can type in your question. But when you do, please be sure to type in your name and at least your last initial, because your questions will not show up to everyone. They will be privately sent to one of my colleagues who will be monitoring the question and answer boxes, and they will be responding to you privately. If you simply type in anonymous, we will not be able to respond to your questions. Additionally, if you send us a question to one of our staff members that would be useful to the entire group tonight, they will send that to myself and I will publicly announce the question and provide an answer. So tonight I want to introduce a few folks who may be joining us online, but I can tell you who is. The chairman of the Critical Area Commission is joining us tonight, Chairman Charles Deegan. We also have our executive director joining us tonight, Kate Charbonneau. I have colleagues of mine who are helping with the live event, Bob Chickanity, who is providing assistance to me tonight, and also two other staff members who are going to be monitoring your question and answers, Charlotte Sheeran, who's one of our program chiefs, and Alex DeWeese, who is one of our critical area planners. We also would like to welcome the Town of Northeast staff, Melissa McKenzie, and also Betsy Vanell and Lisa Rhodes. And I also want to provide a public thank you to all three of them for assisting us during this mapping update to the Town of Northeast. And if any of them want to say anything, either at this time or later, please let us know and we'll be happy to let you do so. So with that, I'm going to start my presentation. It will be brief, but it's going to explain a few things about the critical area. And then Ryan Mello, who is from the Eastern Shore Regional GIS Cooperative in Salisbury, who's affiliated with our office and works with us on updating maps throughout the critical area, will be also sending or presenting to you information about how we actually made the maps that you see. So with that, I'll begin my presentation. Again, my name is Lisa Herger. I'm the Mapping and Regulations Coordinator with the Critical Area Commission for the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays. And we'll start with the first question, which is, what is the Critical Area Program? For some of you that are being mapped in, if you will, to the critical area for the first time, you're probably wondering what it is. Our act was passed 30-some years ago, back in 1984, by the General Assembly, and that was prompted by a study that was done by the Environmental Protection Agency back in the late 70s and was published in September of 1983. And you can see a copy of the title page of that report on the screen. What that report found was that not only the water quality, but the living resources in the bay were in severe decline. And a lot of it had to do with the impacts that we were having on the land. So the legislature came up with the Critical Area Program, which is essentially a land use and resource protection program. And how that works is through local zoning and subdivision codes throughout various jurisdictions around the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. And it involves regulatory requirements, which we're going to talk about in a minute, when there's development activity proposed within the critical area. So where is the critical area? You can see on your screen, there's an image of the state of Maryland, and all of the green counties, mostly Western Maryland coming towards Central Maryland, do not have critical area within them. The counties that are blue are all jurisdictions that include critical area, which is highlighted in yellow. And you'll notice that the yellow is a ribbon, if you will, surrounding the main stem of the Chesapeake Bay and all of the various major tidal tributaries like the Potomac, the Patuxent, and all of the major tributaries on the eastern shore, including the Northeast River, which flows directly past your own town. The waters underneath the bay are part of the critical area, and the land within 1,000 feet of the edge of the tidal waters around your town, or the edge of tidal wetlands from your town extending landward, are within the critical area. So that's how we get the yellow, if you will, that's showing up on this image. And within the state of Maryland, approximately 11% of the entire state is within the critical area, or 680,000 acres. So the question is, we already have critical area maps. The town has maps in their town office. Why are we updating their maps? And the reason for that is, when the Critical Area Act was passed in 1984, the only mapping resources available to the state of Maryland at the time were what we call 1972 tidal wetlands maps. And the image on your screen shows you what those maps look like. They're essentially black and white. Sometimes they're a little blurry, and they're not what we consider either orthorectified or properly georeferenced. So they don't account for the curvature of the earth, and therefore any measurement off of the edge of where a tidal wetland might be on those maps or shoreline could inherently be inaccurate. The other thing that we know about the Chesapeake Bay shoreline and the wetlands are there's been extensive changes to the shoreline since the time of the 1972 maps. In fact, even though the maps are called 1972 maps, much of the aerial photography that was done for these maps was done in the mid to late 60s. So they're actually older information than 72. The other reason we want to update now is that the original 1,000-foot boundary was not always uniform and consistent. Many times it was manually drawn from those 1972 images, so we know that it's inherently inaccurate. And also, electronic maps, so maps that you can access online, are the industry standard, and the critical area boundary should be web accessible. So if anyone has a question about whether I'm in the critical area or not, they can find out by going to many resources that are available online. And in 2012, am I getting that right? 2012, House Bill 1253 updated the critical area. I'm sorry, it was in 2008, excuse me, House Bill 1253. There was a sweeping change to the critical area provisions in the natural resources article. And one of those things included these mapping provisions, which requires the state to update the critical area 1,000-foot boundary that was based on those original maps, but base it now on current information, which Ryan is going to talk to you about in a minute. And the commission worked with state and local governments, and in this case, including the town of Northeast, to develop these maps. So the obvious question now is, what does this mean for my property? So the image on your screen is a screen capture of the interactive map that we sent a link to in your letters that you can see online. And the red line is the current 1,000-foot boundary around the town of Northeast, and the broken dashed line is the proposed line. So you'll see that there's areas where there's a gap, and that's where we've had a loss in the critical area line, and those properties are being removed. And then there's areas where we've had a gain, and those are the folks that have been notified of a change to their property. In the critical area, there's 3 critical area designations. The town of Northeast only has 2 of these critical area designations. They act as overlay zones over your existing underlying zone. So for example, your property may be mapped as residential, but if it's in the critical area, it could have an overlay of either an intensely developed area or a limited development area. There are no resource conservation areas mapped in the town of Northeast. On the back of the letter that you received from Chairman Deegan was a snapshot of your lot or parcel that showed where the line was being proposed on your property, and it also had a color shading on it, which indicated whether it was either in an intensely developed area or a limited development area. If the color on your letter was red, it indicated that you're being mapped in an intensely developed area. And if it was yellow, it indicated it was a limited development area, overlaying your underlying zoning. If you are in an intensely developed area, the only changes that would occur is if you applied for a permit. If you're not applying for a building permit, there are no changes. There's nothing that you have to comply with. However, if you do apply for a permit, say to put in a shed or an addition, and you're in an intensely developed area as indicated by red on your letter, that generally will require some type of stormwater management. And in the town, basically that could mean some type of small practice on your property or some type of planting. If you're in a limited development area, the critical area requirement would be, and again, only if you're applying for a permit or subdivision activity, there are impervious surface limits and clearing limits in the critical area in limited development areas. So finally, just to repeat that if you are in the critical area and you have existing structures or development on your parcel or lot, those existing structures are considered grandfathered and nothing is necessary for you to do at this time. It would only mean that if you're going to propose future development activities that require a building permit from the town, that you'd be subject to the requirements that I just outlined previously. So that is the end of my presentation, and I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Ryan Mello, and he is going to explain how the maps were actually crafted.
I believe my screen is showing.
Yes.
Okay. As Lisa said, my name is Ryan Mello, and I work at the ESRGC, and that stands for the Eastern Shore Regional GIS Cooperative, and we are a part of Salisbury University. We're in the geography department. We actually are a cooperative of former students and current students as interns that work on projects and provide services for local state governments, nonprofits, and we also partner with other organizations to provide mapping services, do project management, provide interns, data collection, and create websites or web apps. Sorry, just making sure that's out of the screen. We were tasked with this remapping update project because the last time it was mapped was in the early 70s, and they obviously wanted to update those. So the first step that we did was create a pilot project. We chose Baltimore County and Talbot County to do the pilot project. We did those 2 counties because Baltimore would give you a more urban area and Talbot County could give you more rural. And between those 2, we would be able to find a lot of the areas that we would need to use for the rest of the mapping for the rest of the title counties. So now I'm going to kind of walk you through a wetland and show you one that's in Northeast and show you how it was mapped through this process. So the first step in the process is to get the most current imagery that we have. I'm going to turn on the little laser pointer so you'll be able to see that. The imagery that you're seeing right now is true color. So we get the most current true color imagery at the time of the mapping. On the right side, you see a blue line, and that is how we represent the shoreline or the edge of open water. So we take into account a couple factors. One of those is the location of the water at the time. So when the imagery is flown, it can be flown at high tide, low tide, middle tide, slack tide. It's kind of all over the place throughout the county. So we need to know where it is at a specific point. So we take that into account. So if area has really high flooding, it may just be high tide. So we do use alternate years to kind of help even that out. And I'll show in a little bit, we have other layers that help us determine where the edge of shoreline is. We also take into account the width of the channel. So as the channel gets more narrow, it starts to close in and becomes pretty close together. So anywhere under 10 feet is kind of where we cut that off. For one, the scale that we use is 1 to 1200. So when you're doing that scale, the lines tend to start merging into one line, and it shows kind of a sharp point. So we kind of use that as the delineating factor of where we map the edge. Once we have drawn the shoreline, the blue line throughout the entire county, or for this instance, the town, we move toward the wetlands. So for the wetlands, as you can see, it's a different type of imagery. This is color infrared. What color infrared does is it shows green grasses and non-tidal grasses and vegetation as pink, and tidal grasses show up as like a light gray beige color. So even if we didn't know there was a wetland here, the color infrared is showing that this area has wetland vegetation. So that's a good indicator that the wetland that we have here is tidal because it's located next to the open water and the vegetation matches it based on the color infrared we have. So on the right side, you'll see the yellow line. That's where we have mapped the edge of tidal water. So we take into account, again, the color infrared that we are using, the most current at the time, and we compare it also with the true color that we've used before for the shoreline. This is an image that Lisa showed earlier of the 72 wetland map. We use that to also help determine if there was a wetland at the specific site and if we believe there is a wetland there before. So the wetland doesn't perfectly line up with the way that it was there in the early 70s and late 60s. That's a given because, as Lisa said, that's 30, 40 years of change that's happened to this area. But it is important to know that there was a wetland there and it's not a new wetland, or in the opposite case, it was a wetland and now it's no longer there. We want to keep track of where the wetlands are going, if they're increasing, decreasing, and these maps do help us with that. The most important tool that we use is LiDAR. This shows elevation. So the red areas are non-tidal, higher areas. The light blue, dark blue, those are low sea level tidal areas. Sometimes you'll see in here this light shaded of yellowish blue. What those usually indicate are really tight grasses in the vegetation, and they kind of block the light used to create the LiDAR. So they show up as a little bit higher, but again, because we have the color infrared to show that these are vegetation grasses, we have the map of the 72 wetlands, and that helps show that there was a wetland there before. It's a pretty good indicator that this area was there, and it still remains to be tidal. As we go through the process, we leave review points. So for every wetland that we map, we leave a review point. Any discrepancies we see with the open water or shoreline, losses of wetlands, gains wetlands, if there are ponds that were not there in the early 70s but are there now and appear to be tidal, we will flag those. And what we do is we take all of the shoreline review points, all of the wetland review points, and we start doing group reviews. So the first group review will be an internal one here at the ESRDC. Then the next step is to include members of the Critical Area Commission to review those review points. Then we take all of our review points and send them to the county or the town, the local jurisdiction, to do their own internal review. They create more review points. Then we combine all those review points and create large web conference calls, kind of similar to this, where we review all of the review points. And the point of these group reviews are to signal where the changes are and to also find out where the site visits that we need to complete are. Also, the county or the town will have additional resources that we maybe didn't have prior to this. They may know of permits, or they may have other historical documents, recent wetland delineations that can help solve issues that we have found through the mapping process. So once we finish these group reviews, we set up site visits. And so we go out into the field, as long as we have permission on those sites, and determine exactly where the tidal wetland line is. We take biologists, we take wetland scientists, we take the Maryland Department of the Environment, we take DNR, critical area staff, and then local jurisdiction staff, and we all go out and determine where the extent of tidal limit is at that time. So that data we take from the field and use it and remap these maps on the computer, and then we provide them as a service to you. So this, I'm going to show two different changes in the town of Northeast. There's one semi-major gain, and then there's a major loss. So the first one we're going to talk about is the gain. So on the left side, you see this blue channel of open water that's kind of cutting into the houses. This area was not on the previous maps, so that is a gain in tidal extent. I will show you the 72 maps next so you can see what I was talking about. We actually did a site visit to this area, so we walked all along this channel and confirmed that it is tidal. So because this area is a tidal increase and an increase in the edge of shoreline, it has bumped out the 1,000-foot boundary. So the red line that you see is where the 1,000-foot line was drawn before, and that was drawn kind of the edge of the shoreline in the 70s, was just cutting off this channel. And now because we have this channel added on, it has pushed the boundary out and brought in these parcels in between the current and the proposed. This is the original 72 map. As you can see, if you can see, I hope you can see, the original shoreline ended back here. So that is what has caused the change in the extent. So again, this is just the image showing you where that shoreline has increased, which has pushed back the proposed boundary. This along the Northeast River is the loss. So we also walked out along this river, all along here to determine where the tidal extent ends. Originally, the tidal extent ended closer to the bridge, which is why the current boundary, the red line, is pushed back. But now that the tidal extent has decreased, it has brought closer to the water. So these houses that are in the in-between, they have been brought out of the critical area. So this is the original 70s maps. This black line that you see in the middle of the map, that's where the tidal extent ended in the 70s, and that's where it created the original 1,000-foot boundary that we're now comparing to. So once we have the site visits complete and we've gone through all the review points, we've made all the changes, the next step is to review the actual critical area. So the area in between the shoreline, the wetlands, and the proposed boundary. That's the designations that Lisa was talking about earlier. For Northeast, it's LDA basically on the west side and IDA on the east side. And any areas that had a gain, so these little gaps that I'm showing on the right, those had to be given a designation, which was IDA. And anywhere that was losses, we have flagged those and reviewed with the town. So this is showing you the full proposed critical area map for the town of Northeast after our mapping. Once we have that proposed layer done and we've reviewed it with the town and they've agreed on it, we have the next stage, which is the public notification process, which you're a part of right now. So this is a change analysis map. It is showing areas of loss and areas of gain. Areas that you may see of loss or gain along the water, those are just differences between the mapping. So originally the critical area designation layer may not have included open water, and now we have it included as water. As Lisa mentioned before, that open water is included as the 1,000-foot critical area. So that's why you see those along the edge of the shoreline. The main ones we're focused on are the areas on the outside of the boundary, the losses and the gains. So once we have this layer, the change analysis, we notify the properties that have a gain of 1% or more. And the reason we choose the 1% to kind of help with evening out the properties that are being brought in. So as Lisa mentioned before, we're taking these original 72 wetland maps, which are paper maps. We're scanning them into the computer. And as you saw in the images there, they have mismatch issues, lineup issues. Some of them are missing, some of them are shifted. So that kind of helps get rid of that error that you take from taking a paper map and bring it into a digital world. So that's why we use the 1%. Otherwise, any property that's along the 1,000-foot proposed boundary would be getting a letter based on a gain. So as I said, we have notified the properties. We have set up a web map, which Lisa showed a link to you before, and I will show it to you again now. This web map is a permanent fixture, so you will be able to log into that even after this mapping time has ended. Once the maps have been approved, you also will be able to log in, and the maps will show you which areas are approved and which are still in process. Even areas that are not along the water, addresses of parcels you may know of or have that are outside of the 1,000-foot area, you can put those in and they'll let you know how close you are to the critical area. So this web tool is very easy to use, and anyone that you contact the Critical Area Commission can help you with using the web map if you do have questions. So that is the end of my presentation. So I believe if you have any questions that haven't been answered in the chat, we can go over those now.
Do we have any questions, Bob?
We do not.
Okay. I just want to remind folks who may be listening in, Ryan's last screen shows you our email addresses. It also has our phone numbers, but also you can just Google us and find us on the internet. We will be available to anyone who needs to still contact us with questions after this evening to answer any that you may still have. Also, I want to let folks know that after tonight's meeting, it will probably be a few weeks. And what will happen next is that the maps that have been created for the town of Northeast will be officially delivered by our chairman to the town. And the date of that delivery will begin a 2-year time clock. So the town will have 2 years to officially adopt the updated maps. After that is completed, the Critical Area Commission will do a final approval, and it won't be until that date of approval that the maps will become the official maps for the town of Northeast. Again, if anyone has any questions, please call our office at 410-260-3460 or the town of Northeast at 410-287-5801. Or again, you can Google us and you can use one of the emails listed on the screen, and we'd be happy to either call you on the phone or set up some kind of virtual meeting to discuss your questions. I thank everyone for tuning in with us this evening, and I hope you have a very good evening. Take care.